Hello everyone, my name is Aaron Spears, Young Adult Librarian right here at the Westlake Porter Public Library. The United States is currently seeing levels of activism, of protest, of civic engagement at levels it has not seen for decades. And we wanted to take this time to let you know about some of the materials here at Westlake Porter Public Library to help get you engaged, get you informed, get you inspired, get you active. Because one of the reasons things tend to stay the same and never change is because it's very, very, very easy to do nothing. Especially if you're a young adult who maybe isn't even of voting age yet, it's very easy to feel powerless. Luckily, it's also very easy to get inspired, which is the goal of this particular book talk today. So to young adults out there who are learning about how the world works and seeing the many, many injustices taking place, it can feel very overwhelming, at times unnerving. It can be just downright sad and frustrating sometimes, especially since we're all living through a global pandemic at the same time that these issues need our attention. So I'll be speaking about 4 titles from the Young Adult Collection, and my colleague Chad will be speaking about 4 titles from the Adult Collection. Because, you know, if you're young adults, you're on your way to the adult section, and sometimes you're adults, there's really great young adult material that you may want to use to check out certain issues as well. So these are just a sampling of the extensive materials that we have here at the library to help you navigate the world. So Chad is also our local history librarian. So when you have history questions and the issues that we're speaking about today have a long, long history, he's the one to ask. So let's jump right in. I'm going to throw it over to Chad to start us off here.
Aaron, thank you for the great introduction. My name is Chad Sottler. I'm the local history librarian here at the Westlake Porter Public Library. And in keeping with the themes introduced by Aaron, I wanted to draw attention to some of the books we have here in the adult collection that touch on themes of racism and discrimination and the part it plays in history. So the first book I wanted to talk about is The Slave Ship, A Human History by Marcus Rediker. In the course of 3 centuries, millions of Africans were kidnapped, enslaved, and transported from the coast of Africa to the Americas. They were held in cramped and unsanitary conditions alongside their captors, where the constant threat of violence, shipwrecks, and sharks were ever present. Based on decades of research, Rediker shines a light into the darkest reaches of the slave ship. Besides being a tale of misery and despair, it's also a tale of survival, rebellion, and the birth of a nascent African-American culture born out of the mixing of various ethnic groups, cultures, and languages on the slave ship. Rediker talks about this rather dark period of history with great feeling and great sympathy for the subject. And if you're interested in learning more about the slave ship and the role that the enslaved played in this great drama and the captains and the crews, this would be a great place to start.
So the first one, I'm going to start off with the history one because I find history fascinating. It's called We Are Everywhere, Protest, Power, and Pride in the History of Queer Liberation by Matthew Reamer and Leighton Brown. Since we're in the middle of June, it's Pride Month, I figured this is the perfect one to start with. A common phrase I hear from young adults is, history is boring. And my response, it's the same thing I tell my kids when I hear them say that too, is just, well, it's kind of frustration at first, but also just start reading different books, start reading different history of topics that interest you. If you're into video games, read about video games. There's plenty of crazy stuff out there that has happened in history and it's documented and it will definitely hook you. So I would suggest try this book. Reamer and Brown have put together a book that has the size, the weight, it's big, and the copious amounts of photograph to be what you call like a coffee table book, something you could just pick up and enjoy in short bursts of free time. However, if you actually take the time though and dive in on this book, you'll find it to be a thorough history of the queer liberation movement. They cover from like 1865 or so up to the 1995, and they document the victories, the defeats, the heartbreaks, the celebrations, all through the lens of protest and power and pride.
The next book, The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition by Manisha Sinha, wants to place the enslaved at the heart of the narrative about the abolitionist movement. And besides being a movement that many people think started in the 1830s or 1840s, she wants to expand it even prior to the American Revolutionary Movement. She talks in depth about the work that abolitionists did with other radical social movements such as utopianism, socialism, and the labor movement in the United States. She also puts the abolitionist movement in a transnational context by highlighting the influence of the Haitian Revolution on the abolitionist movement in the United States. This book is heavily footnoted and researched. She draws upon years of research in different archives, unearthing new letters, diaries, pamphlets, all sorts of new material that will help the reader get a good feeling for what the abolitionist movement was all about.
The next one I want to discuss is, unfortunately, starts off with tragedy. On February 14th, 2018, 17 students and teachers were killed and 17 more were wounded at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. It became known as the Parkland school shooting. This book starts with that tragedy, but it's only in the first few pages. You're not going to be reading like a minute-by-minute account of the actual school shooting, but with the school shooting, with school shootings becoming more and more common in this country, tragedy as that is, the students of Parkland kind of collectively decided this one has to be different. The way they react to it has to be different. So what this book actually chronicles is what started after the tragedy of that shooting. It goes on to chronicle how these high school students reacted to tragedy with positive action and change, from social media movements to organizing the March for Our Lives rally, and they now have also established the March for Our Lives Foundation. I love this book for two reasons. One, because as the title suggests, the writers are focused on hope, glimmer of hope. And it's written collectively by like 20 some kids that were all from Parkland, various ages to various grade levels. So they're all 9th through 12th grade. The second reason I love it is because it shows the power of youth. These high school kids saw an injustice and they took action collectively to change things and created one of the largest youth-led movements in the whole world.
The third book, Wilmingtons Lie, The Murderous Coup of 1898 and the Rise of White Supremacy by David Zucchino. By the 1890s, Wilmington, North Carolina was the largest city in the state. It was a bustling port with a mixed-race population led by a fusion government of Republicans and populists. The African-American community in Wilmington was thriving. There were several black-owned businesses. They had their own newspaper. The government of the city included African-American aldermen. There were black police officers, black businesses. It was a thriving community, and it really stood out as a. It really stood out in a way that many other African communities were unable to at that time. However, there were white supremacist Democrats who were working to change all this in the state. Led by prominent citizens, including the publisher of the state's largest newspaper, they sought to change this with intimidation and violence. Finally, on November 8th in 1898, around Election Day, 2,000 people belonging to the Red Shirt movement terrorized African-American women and children and murdered 60 men, and forced city officials to resign at gunpoint. This is a rare instance in American history where an elected government was forcibly overthrown by violence. This just shows this book is really well written. It's somewhat more of a popular history compared to the other two books I've talked about, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. The author clearly did his research, and it just shows that the levels that some within the white community were willing to go at this time to keep African Americans from using their civil rights, participating in government, and and it gives you some things that you can reflect upon.
The next book I wanted to talk about is How I Resist Activism and Hope for a New Generation, edited by Maureen Johnson. Maureen Johnson collected essays, songs, poems, cartoons, interviews, short stories from 29 diverse authors and artists from all kinds of backgrounds from all across the country. There's everything from diversity in comics, guides to media consciousness, so kind of makes you more aware of how you take in media and what type of media you're taking in, and how you curate what are good sources, what are bad sources, what's good information, what's bad information. everything from there to like creating art as well, and how you communicate ideas to people. Is it through an essay? Is it through a poem? Is it through a song? Is it through a comic? Is it through dance? It's through whatever. So one essay actually in this book that I thought was worth highlighting, especially given the current situation of protest and activism going on across the country, is by Juanita Petrus. She's an activist, a writer, and an artist from Minneapolis. She has an essay in here titled, "Could we please give the police departments to the grandmothers?" And she has this great rationale for like what kind of temperament, specifically Minneapolis, which is where she's from, could use in changing its policing tactics, and how the ethics or the ethos of how grandmas raise their grandkids and the role models that grandmas play in our lives could prove like a really interesting template for how community policing could happen. It'll definitely get you thinking about police reform in a really interesting, very creative way. This book will also remind you that you're not helpless in this world. Even if adults sometimes tell you you're too young to make a difference, you're not. This book proves that.
The fourth and final book is The Sword and the Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King by Penny Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. Joseph shows how they both influenced each other during their adult lives. Joseph paints a nuanced picture of both men, one who is remembered for his nonviolent action and the other who is remembered for militancy. Joseph shows this as too simple of an understanding of both men's evolution as civil rights leaders and their politics. For example, in King's final years, his critiques of militarism and materialism often echoed Malcolm's anti-colonialism, and prior to Malcolm's death, his idea of citizenship in a global context and within the United States began to evolve to often more closely reflect Martin Luther King's.
The last book I wanted to talk about is called Steal This Country, A Handbook for Resistance, Persistence, and Fixing Almost Everything by Alexander Styron. This book it's basically your starter kit for activism, for civic engagement. As young adults figuring out where you fit in within society, some portion of this book is guaranteed to speak to you. Styron covers climate change, immigration, LGBTQ rights, intersectionality, racial justice, women's rights, disability issues. Some aspect of social reform and social activism is covered in this book. What I really like about the format and the way she put this book together is that each chapter features a few things. So it's the same format for every single topic that she covers. It starts off with some art. Always great to start with some art. Always great to include some art. It then goes into like a brief history of whatever the topic is, and then it also includes an extended interview with an expert in that field. So somebody who's been studying it, that knows the territory, gives great, well-informed opinions from experts, and then it also finishes up each chapter, each discussion of a topic, with some questions to inspire further action, further research, further investigation, further activism. As young people out there, life can be very complicated right now for you because you're feeling your way through society, figuring out who you are and what defines you. And since identity is a changeable thing, it's good to be taking in more and more information as best you can. And you're in a time of life that allows you to explore and get creative and test some boundaries. And as you change and as you grow and as you explore, the library is here for you with more resources than you'll ever be able to utilize. So we are here to help you explore. So if any of these topics seem of interest to you, try out these books. And if you have more questions, you need more resources, that's literally what we're here for.